She thought she was safe in her own neighborhood. But cameras caught something no one was ever meant to see. A young woman's final moments at the hands of a man who should have been her protector. What unfolded next didn't just terrify a family, it shattered an entire community. This is the story of Evelyn Harnden, and the serial killer hiding in plain sight, George Colburn. But what happened next shocked everyone. It all began in the quiet town of Waverly, Minnesota. A place where neighbors left their doors unlocked. Where the sound of cicadas filled warm summer nights. And where 27-year-old Evelyn Harnden had lived her entire life. Evelyn was loved. A nurse's assistant at the local clinic. Known for her kindness, her laugh that could light up a room, and her devotion to her aging parents. She wasn't famous. She wasn't wealthy. But in Waverly she was unforgettable. Then, there was George Colburn. On paper, just another face in town. A 34-year-old mechanic with grease-stained hands and a reputation for odd behavior. No one suspected he carried darker secrets. Secrets that would soon spill into the open. What connected Evelyn and George? And why was their story captured on camera? Stay with me. And if you're new here, we post daily. Subscribe so you never miss a case. Evelyn Harnden's life was simple, but it was full. She grew up on Oak Ridge Lane in a weathered white farmhouse that overlooked wide fields and a quiet stretch of forest. Neighbors remember the way she waved at passing cars every morning as she headed to the clinic where she worked as a nurse's assistant. Her days started early, often before sunrise, and ended late, but Evelyn never complained. She thrived on helping others. Patients said she had the rare ability to make people feel calm, even in their most vulnerable moments. At 27, Evelyn wasn't married, though she had dated casually. Friends often joked that she was married to her job, but those closest to her knew her priority was family. Her father's health had been failing for years, and Evelyn took on the role of caretaker without hesitation. She was her mother's right hand, her father's lifeline, and the anchor of her family. She loved simple joys. Tending to her small garden, sketching flowers in her notebook, and reading mystery novels late into the night. Ironically, she was drawn to stories about crime, fascinated by the minds of killers and the resilience of survivors. She never imagined she'd one day become the subject of one of those stories. Meanwhile, George Colburn's world was unraveling. Outwardly, he was the town's mechanic, the man who fixed brakes and rotated tires at the corner shop. But beneath that greasy uniform lived a storm of bitterness. His marriage had ended suddenly 2 years prior. He had financial troubles that seemed to multiply every month. And he'd grown increasingly isolated, watching life move on without him. George lived just 4 blocks from Evelyn. He noticed her long before she ever noticed him. He'd see her walking home with grocery bags, pausing to pet neighborhood dogs, or sitting on her porch in the evenings with a cup of tea. To George, Evelyn represented everything he had lost: kindness, stability, connection. But his admiration was twisted. What started as casual glances soon became an obsession. Friends of Evelyn later recalled moments that seemed insignificant at the time. A car idling near the clinic when she worked late, the sound of footsteps behind her on evening walks, or the way she sometimes mentioned feeling like someone was watching her. She brushed it off, laughing at her own nerves. After all, Waverly wasn't the kind of town where bad things happened. But George's fixation grew darker. He began timing his errands to accidentally cross paths with Evelyn. He lingered too long in the background of her world, at the grocery store, outside the post office, even at her church. To most, he blended in as just another resident. To Evelyn, he was little more than a passing face. She never knew how closely he was watching, or how much space she occupied in his mind. The balance of their lives, her quiet kindness and his growing obsession, was on a collision course. And as summer nights grew longer, a tension neither of them could see was tightening like a noose around Evelyn's world. Because soon, the watching would turn into something far more dangerous. It was late August in Waverly. The kind of night where the air hung heavy and the streets were unusually still. Evelyn left the clinic just after 9 p.m., her shift running long. Security footage shows her walking to her car, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear, and unlocking the driver's side door. She looked tired but calm. Nothing about her movements suggested danger was close. But danger was waiting. George Colburn's truck appeared in the corner of the footage, parked across the street with its headlights off. Witnesses would later recall hearing the low rumble of an engine, cutting in and out, as though someone was waiting for the right moment. Evelyn drove home. It was a route she had taken hundreds of times. She passed the gas station, the old mill, and turned onto Oak Ridge Lane. What she didn't see was George trailing her, slow, deliberate, keeping just far enough back not to draw suspicion. Minutes later, another camera caught Evelyn pulling into her driveway, porch light on, grocery bags in hand. She was just steps from the safety of her home. But before she could make it to the front door, the sound of boots on gravel broke the silence. Neighbors reported hearing a muffled cry. One woman told police she thought it was a couple arguing in the street. Another claimed she heard something slam like a car door or heavy object hitting the ground. No one realized they were listening to Evelyn's final struggle. The footage, grainy but undeniable, captured a shadow moving swiftly toward her. Evelyn turned. She barely had time to react. George lunged, his hands gripping her arm, forcing her toward the side of the house where the porch light didn't reach. The camera caught flashes, Evelyn's desperate attempts to pull free, her body twisting, the faint sound of her keys hitting the ground. Then just as quickly the screen went dark as George dragged her out of view. By the time her parents realized she hadn't come inside, it was too late. Evelyn's mother found her groceries spilled across the steps. Keys in the dirt. But no Evelyn. Panic set in. Calls to her phone went unanswered. Minutes felt like hours. Finally, her father dialed 911. Police arrived within minutes, sweeping the yard with flashlights. The air was still thick with humidity. Dogs barked from nearby homes. But there was no sign of Evelyn, only the small trail of groceries and a single shoe lying in the grass. Within an hour, the neighborhood was awake. Porch lights flickered on, whispers spread, and people gathered in clusters at the end of the street. Officers moved quickly to canvass the area, questioning neighbors, checking sheds, and scanning the road for tire marks. One officer described the scene as eerily calm, like the world had just swallowed her whole. But buried within that calm were the first pieces of evidence: shadows on camera, scattered belongings, and an unsettling silence that suggested Evelyn's disappearance wasn't random. The hunt for Evelyn had begun. But the town had no idea just how close the killer already was. The disappearance of Evelyn Harnden sent shockwaves through Waverly. Police launched a full-scale search before sunrise. Volunteers combed through fields, officers swept the forest, and helicopters scanned the countryside. For the first time in decades, the quiet town was crawling with flashing lights and crime scene tape. At first, investigators treated it as a missing persons case. There was no body, no confession, just a trail of belongings left at the front steps. Detectives interviewed Evelyn's parents. They were shaken but clear. Evelyn would never disappear willingly. She had too many responsibilities, too much love for her family. Something terrible had happened. Neighbors described what they'd seen or thought they'd seen. A dark truck idling on the corner. A figure moving quickly near Evelyn's porch. A scream that faded almost as soon as it started. But the details were scattered, uncertain, clouded by the haze of night. George Colburn's name surfaced almost immediately. He had been seen at the gas station that night, roughly around the time Evelyn left work. His old pickup matched the vague description of the truck witnesses reported. Still, suspicion wasn't proof. George even volunteered an alibi. He claimed he had gone home after grabbing cigarettes and spent the rest of the night watching television. But then, detectives pulled the security footage. It was grainy, black and white, but the outline of George's truck was unmistakable. The dent in the passenger side door, the missing hubcap, it was all there. The footage placed him less than 100 yards from Evelyn in the moments before she vanished. When officers questioned him again, George remained calm. Too calm. He insisted he was being framed, that dozens of people in town drove trucks like his. But investigators noted something chilling. He never once asked about Evelyn. Never once expressed concern that a neighbor was missing. Forensic teams scoured Evelyn's driveway and yard. They found faint tire marks in the grass consistent with George's vehicle. They also recovered a torn fragment of fabric snagged on a fence post. Later analysis revealed it matched the uniform George often wore at the mechanic's shop. But the most damning discovery came from Evelyn's phone. Detectives traced her last movements and found she had received multiple anonymous calls in the weeks before her disappearance. Calls from a prepaid phone. Records showed that very same phone had pinged off towers near George's home. Still, the case didn't break open overnight. George wasn't the only suspect. Investigators briefly looked into an ex-boyfriend of Evelyn's, combed through co-workers' timelines, even chased rumors about a drifter seen passing through town. Each lead fizzled, eating away at precious time. But then, police obtained the final clip from the surveillance camera. The footage showed not only George's truck but also a shadowy figure dragging something out of frame near Evelyn's porch. The body language, the build, it all pointed to George. The town's patience snapped. Fear turned into outrage. Neighbors demanded answers. And detectives knew one thing. If they didn't act quickly, George Colburn could slip away or strike again. The evidence was mounting. But what police uncovered next would reveal that Evelyn's murder was not George's first. George Colburn was brought in for questioning a third time. By then, detectives had enough to push harder. They presented the footage. They showed him the fabric scrap. They laid out the phone records connecting him to those late-night calls. At first, George denied everything. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, repeating the same line, "I don't know what you're talking about." But cracks began to show. His answers grew shorter. His breathing heavier. When pressed about the truck seen outside Evelyn's home, he broke eye contact. Finally, after 12 hours inside the interrogation room, George slipped. He muttered, "She wasn't supposed to scream." That single sentence shifted the case from suspicion to confession. Detectives secured a warrant and searched his property. In the back of George's garage, hidden beneath a tarp, they found Evelyn's purse. Her ID, credit cards, and phone were still inside. A set of blood-stained work gloves lay nearby. Forensic testing later confirmed the blood was Evelyn's. But the search uncovered something far more chilling. Boxes of newspaper clippings. Photos of women from surrounding counties. And journals filled with disturbing notes about watching, timing, and choosing the right one. It became clear Evelyn wasn't the first. She was simply the latest victim in a pattern no one had noticed. Investigators connected George to at least 2 other disappearances in neighboring towns, cases once thought to be unrelated. The similarities were undeniable. Young women, late nights, isolated abductions, and belongings discarded in plain sight. For years, George had been hiding in the open, blending in as just another mechanic, while quietly hunting his victims. The trial gripped Minnesota. Reporters packed the courtroom. Families of other missing women came forward, desperate for answers. Evelyn's parents sat silently through each hearing, holding hands, listening as prosecutors laid out the evidence. The CCTV footage. The torn fabric. The journals. Piece by piece, George's mask of normalcy crumbled. When the verdict was read, the courtroom fell silent. Guilty on all counts. First-degree murder. Kidnapping. Aggravated assault. The judge did not hesitate. George Colburn was sentenced to life without parole. But for Waverly, the damage was permanent. The town that once prided itself on safety could never return to its innocence. Parents no longer let children walk home alone. Porch lights stayed on through the night. And every passing truck on Oak Ridge Lane carried a reminder of the monster who had lived among them. Evelyn's funeral drew hundreds. Nurses in uniform carried white roses. Friends spoke of her compassion, her selflessness, the way she made others feel seen. Her parents wept quietly as the casket lowered, their lives forever marked by a night that began like any other and ended in horror. George Colburn is now remembered not as a mechanic, but as a predator. A serial killer who terrorized small towns while pretending to be ordinary. And though justice was served, the question lingers, how many more victims remain hidden in the shadows of his past? Because in cases like this, closure is never truly complete. George Colburn was not the kind of man people feared at first glance. To neighbors, he was quiet, unremarkable, even forgettable. But psychologists often warn monsters don't always announce themselves. Sometimes they blend in. Experts later described George as exhibiting the classic hallmarks of a predatory offender. He was socially withdrawn but observant. He studied routines, memorized habits, and watched for weakness. In Evelyn's case, her predictability, her nightly drive home, her devotion to her parents, her kindness to strangers made her the perfect target for someone seeking control. Control. That was George's motive at the core. Not money, not revenge, but dominance. His journals revealed an obsessive need to decide when a victim lived and when they didn't. He referred to it as timing the hunt. This language mirrors patterns seen in serial offenders who treat human lives as conquests rather than connections. Psychologists call it cognitive distortion. It's when killers reframe their crimes as justified or even necessary. George wrote that Evelyn looked through him like he didn't exist. To him, that rejection wasn't a passing slight, it was fuel. Instead of seeing Evelyn as a person with dreams, family, and value, he reduced her to a symbol of everything he believed life had denied him. His behavior also fit the profile of an escalation pattern. Experts believe George may have stalked and fantasized for years before acting. Each encounter, each close call, emboldened him. By the time Evelyn crossed his path, George's fantasies had hardened into action. Another chilling detail, George displayed no remorse. Even during trial, when Evelyn's family described their grief, he sat motionless, eyes fixed on the floor. Criminologists argue this absence of empathy is what makes serial offenders so dangerous. They don't see their victims as human beings, they see them as objects. So, was George born a killer or was he shaped into one? The truth may lie somewhere in between. His failed marriage, financial ruin, and years of loneliness may have accelerated his descent, but psychologists stress millions endure those hardships without violence. What set George apart was his choice to funnel anger into obsession. An obsession, unchecked, became lethal. In Evelyn's case, the tragedy is twofold. She became the victim of a man driven by pathology she never could have predicted. And Waverly learned too late that evil often hides behind ordinary faces. Evelyn Harnden's story is one of stolen innocence. A young woman whose life was built on kindness, cut short by the obsessions of a man who hid his darkness in plain sight. Her murder left a family broken, a town forever changed, and a chilling reminder that danger can live right next door. George Colburn is behind bars. His mask of normalcy ripped away. But justice doesn't erase the loss. It doesn't silence the question that still lingers: how many others never made it home? For Evelyn's parents, the answer will never be enough. For Waverly, safety will never feel the same. And for us, her story stands as proof that true crime isn't just headlines, it's the lives of real people whose voices deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to Behind the Crime. And I'll leave you with this question. Do you think killers like George are born with darkness inside them? Or does the world create them?